impact on German naval policy and German armament. And this is what we will spend focus on today. My name is Stefan Huck. I'm director of the German Naval Museum in Wilhelmshaven. I moderate this panel as the originally announced moderator. Captain Dr. Hillman is unfortunately prevented to attend. We decided, I hope Mr. Bird, it's okay for you, to change a little bit the program, the set list. So we would like to start with the paper of Karin Lange, as it is in a chronological way, the first paper, and then Christian Jentsch will continue, and Guntram Schulze-Wegner will close the list of panelists before your commentary. We will hold each paper one after another, have then, after the commentary, discussion, hopefully a vivid discussion for all papers together. The panelists have 20 to 25 minutes to talk, I think. And I would like to ask all contributors that aren't speaking to mute themselves and unmute when they like to contribute. Yes, and let's start with the first panelist. It's Karin Lange. She's now research associate at the Center for Military Studies, Center for Military History and Social Sciences in Potsdam. She holds a degree. Just a second. She holds a degree of BA in Augsburg and MA from the Fern University in Hagen. Afterwards, she had been for 3 years research associate at the University of Bielefeld, and her point of interest, or she's interested in comparisons and comparative studies, and she will now talk. She will now talk to us. She changed a little bit the title of her paper on the topic of a surprisingly intensive interest, the press, German public opinion, and the Washington Conference 1921 to 1922. So we start with the first paper. The floor is yours.
One moment, I am going to share my screen, and that's, yes. Okay. So that looks great, right? Can you see my presentation?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, great, that's awesome. Okay, so thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm happy to be here, or I would be more happy to be in Annapolis, but that's what it is like at the moment. So my presentation is not as much about naval policy, but about the public perception in Germany of the Washington Conference as depicted in the German press, in the German newspaper press. So when I wrote the initial abstract for this year's McMullen Naval Symposium, I was interested in how the German press and the public perceived and interpreted the Washington Conference with regards to naval disarmament and the future of the German Navy. I then analyzed the press coverage of 3 German daily newspapers between July 1921 and May 1922, but it became clear that in the months prior to, during, and shortly after the conference, the topics and proceedings of the conference were not discussed in connection with the future of the German Navy. In the early 1920s, coping with the past and the present was more important than looking ahead. However, I discovered that by analyzing the articles that there is a lot to learn about the available information on the conference in Germany. Even more important, there is a lot to learn about the sentiment, opinion, and agency of the German press, German former naval officers, and the German public with regards to the Washington Conference and connected topics like naval disarmament, sea power, or strategy. And this is what I want to talk about today. So I start with a brief overview of the historical context, followed by some remarks on the press and public opinion. I then proceed along 3 lines: sentiment, opinion, and agency, and at the end I will provide a short conclusion. So I am going to start with the historical context. In autumn 1921, the remaining great powers, the United States of America, Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, together with some other powers, met in Washington. They discussed the question of naval and land disarmament, as well as the question of stability in East Asia and the Pacific. Disarmament and the cutting of defense expenditure was popular. So at the end of the conference in February 1922, the powers had concluded several treaties, among which the Treaty on Limiting Naval Armaments is the one that is nowadays connected with the Washington Conference. Today, it seems almost forgotten that the question of land disarmament, although without result, was also discussed in Washington. So what about Germany? Despite of rumors in August and November 1921, Germany had not been invited to the conference. After the war, Germany had lost her great power status, had been deprived of any significant military and naval power, and did no longer have any possessions in the Pacific. Additionally, France was strongly opposed to a German invitation. Nevertheless, there was a strong interest in the conference in Germany. I analyzed 3 German newspapers, the Social Democratic Vorwärts, the liberal left Berliner Tageblatt, and the more or less conservative semi-official Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung. Between July 1921 and February 1922, they published together around 1,170 articles on the Washington Conference. The coverage comprised all sorts of articles. They ranged from short messages with 1 sentence to long commentaries, editorials, and background articles. The content was diverse: observations of the foreign press, reports on the proceedings of the negotiations, the political attitude of the participating powers towards naval and land disarmament, or the Pacific question, to name just a few. The newspapers further provided background knowledge about the obstacles of disarmament, the strategic and political situation of the involved powers, and the level of their armaments. Other articles were commentaries and reflections on the prospects of the conference, as well as the meaning and consequences for the involved powers, the world, Europe, or Germany. So based on the assumption that the press does not only shape but also is shaped by public opinion, I argue that the extent of the press coverage indicates a huge interest within the German public for the Washington Conference and the topics discussed there. It seems that contemporary observers, like one of the editors of the Berliner Tageblatt, were themselves surprised. He wrote on November 28, 1921, I quote, "Although the German audience nowadays talks more about facts like that the goose, which had been an easily accessible animal, now costs 300 marks, the proceedings at the Washington Conference are observed with a surprisingly intensive interest." Unquote. So on the one hand, this was surely due to the awareness for the global interconnection and entanglement of the political, military, economic, and social sphere, the existence of a transnational sphere of communication, and a general interest in international affairs and foreign politics. On the other hand, this was due to a possible impact of the conference on Germany. The significance of the negotiations in Washington for the world and for Germany with regards to global and European stability was acknowledged in the newspapers. Before the beginning of the conference, there was the hope that the conference would solve the ongoing economic crisis, that it would contain the French pursuit of hegemony in Europe, and that it would set the example for future disarmament. I fully acknowledge that newspapers have their limits as sources to say something about public opinion, which is in itself a tricky term. One should be careful to automatically extrapolate from newspaper articles to the opinion of the Germans. Although the press was perceived by various political players as influencing public opinion, it is almost impossible to say anything about how these articles were received. One should always bear in mind that the press was used as a medium for the political fight over opinions and that the recipients themselves had a variety of opinions. Nevertheless, newspaper articles are a significant source to get an impression of public sentiment, opinion, and agency, and they further indicate which information was available to the public to form any opinion. So we now come to to my findings. So as I said before, I want to present some of my findings along the three lines of sentiment, opinion, and agency. However, this separation is a bit artificial and primarily serves as a way of structuring the talk. As you will see, when I talk of sentiment, for example, that's of course often connected with opinion and so on. So the first line I want to talk about is sentiment. So one topic that is definitely linked to sentiment is the question of land disarmament. Notwithstanding that from the beginning the question of land disarmament was of secondary importance for the conference, it was the most important question for Germany. And there was a quite simple reason for this: Germany's neighbor France. From the first day of the press coverage related to the Washington Conference in July, France and the French attitude towards disarmament was one of the most important topics in all of the three newspapers. All three newspapers shared a similar opinion about an imperialistic and militaristic France that pursued to maintain the hegemonic position in Europe and that was responsible for the current instability. The articles showed that in the German perception, an agreement on disarmament would at least have meant a containment of French plans for hegemony. Further, an agreement would have reduced French military spending, for which Germany, in the view of the Vorwärts and the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, had to pay. One other reason for the sometimes very emotional press coverage was the French assertion of a German peril, which was used to legitimate the reluctant attitude towards land disarmament. France was only willing to talk about land disarmament if there would be a guarantee that the other allies would step in to help France in the event of any German aggression. Two interconnected arguments were brought forward by the French. The first was that France was threatened by German nationalism and the pursuit of revenge. The second argument was that Germany was able to immediately build a large army to fight a war of revenge. How did the newspapers react to these arguments? On the one hand, the Vorwärts and the Berliner Tageblatt acknowledged that there were people in Germany who pursued revenge, and they criticized them clearly. On the other hand, all three newspapers criticized the French accusations as exaggerated and wrong. For them, it was propaganda and a way to legitimate French armaments in the public and to avoid any agreement on land disarmament. The defense against the French accusations definitely reached its climax after French Prime Minister Briand's speech at the conference on November 21, 1921. He basically brought forward the arguments outlined above. While the German government was unable to react due to diplomatic practices, the press still could. In this specific situation, the press served as a voice for the sentiment of the public in the full awareness that everywhere in the world, the press coverage in foreign countries was closely monitored by governments, the press, and the public. So one of the very obvious topics that is linked to the question of opinion is how the newspapers and the guest commentator thought about the prospect of reaching an agreement on disarmament. Despite nuances and differences in all the three newspapers, one finds on the one hand skepticism about reaching an agreement on arms limitation. On the other hand, they voiced hopes that there would be an agreement in order to stabilize international relations and to safeguard peace in a still war-shattered world. However, what I want to focus on today is a topic related to the prospect of disarmament, the question which formula should be used to calculate the level of armaments allowed to each power, as well as the question of the comparability and measurement of relative strength of military and naval capabilities. These issues have been some of the major obstacles to disarmament since the end of the 19th century and actually still are. The difficulty of finding a formula and the question of comparability were used as justifications of why arms limitation was impossible and why all arms limitation attempts had been failed since the First Hague Conference in 1899. Against this background, And in combination with the awareness of how important these technical questions were for the negotiations, it is unsurprising that this was one set of topics featured in the articles, especially in the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung. Otto Giese, for example, one of the editors and former naval officer, informed the readers not only about the tonnage and number of the British, Japanese, and American capital ships and the naval spending of the three great powers, but also about the possible obstacles to reach an agreement on disarmament. For him, one of them was definitely the issue of finding a, I quote, key which will take into account the interests of the individual powers with regards to the relative force levels and the strategic conditions, unquote. In another article, he gave a detailed account of the American disarmament proposal and again provided information about the current number of ships built in the various countries. Like in the first article, he described the issue of comparability and to find a formula. In his opinion, the combat value of a fleet was more than capital ships. One had to take into account submarines, aircraft, naval bases, and alliances. He believed that the only way to overcome these difficulties was by basing the arms limitation on a limitation of budgets. That this idea faced similar difficulties than the idea of arms limitation by numbers, because there was, for example, no agreement on what military expenditure actually included, he did not mention. Similar views about the important question of how to measure naval power were voiced in other articles in the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, so Giese was not alone with his views. Giese's quite pessimistic outlook was surely influenced by previous attempts to reach an agreement between the great powers. What he did not know when he wrote his articles was that this time the political will to reach an agreement was so strong that the involved powers accepted the limited validity of simple comparisons of the number and tonnage of ships in order to avoid a failure. So I now want to talk about agency. There are two topics I want to briefly talk about with regards to the question of agency. The first is that the former German naval elite merged their writings about the naval disarmament question negotiated at Washington with their agenda of defending the German Navy against criticism. The Navy, especially the High Seas Fleet, had not lived up to the expectations of neither the Navy itself nor the German public during the war. Naval officers in particular were confronted with the disappointment of their expectations. After the war, criticism was raised that the fleet had made war more probable due to the arms race, that the Navy had been ineffective during the war, that the unrestricted submarine war had caused the United States to enter the war, and finally that the Navy had been responsible for the revolution. Active and inactive naval officers embarked on a publicist counteroffensive to delegitimize this criticism and to try to save the Navy from falling into insignificance. These pieces of writing were not only a tool to regain ground in public perception, but a tool to process the disappointment about the war and about the fact that they thought that the German public had jettisoned the Navy. By then, retired Vice Admiral Karl Hollweg was one of these officers. Between July 1921 and March 1922, he published 1 to 2 articles per month in the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung. He dealt with the question of naval disarmament and related questions of sea power, strategy, or the significance of capital ships, which were important to understand the negotiations in Washington. Hollweg had been a key figure in the German Navy, not all, but before the war. Not all, but many of Hollweg's articles can be best described as the processing of the loss of German world power status due to the loss of her naval power. He further seemed to have processed the attitude of the German public towards the Navy after the war. He clearly expressed his own anger and hatred over the British attitude towards Germany before the war as he had perceived it, and his anger about the British use of sea power in peace and war. Moreover, all of his articles can be interpreted as a means to transport his ideas about sea power. So, for example, in the article Fleet Arithmetics, Hollweg wrote about the 5 to 5 to 3 ratio that was discussed in Washington as a basis for naval disarmament. He used his explanations of the 5 to 5 to 3 ratio and its implications as a starting point to talk about the British use of political fleet arithmetics, as he called it, before the war, for which the 2-power standard or the 2-to-1 ratio in capital ships to Germany were 2 examples. Hollweg believed that the British unwillingness to accept the 10-16 ratio as a basis for an Anglo-German naval agreement before 1914 was one of the reasons for the war, and that Great Britain had gained nothing through this war except of losing her supreme position, which she could have easily kept with an agreement, in his opinion. On the one hand, this was a contribution to the ongoing debate about the naval arms race's part in causing the war, and the question if an Anglo-German agreement would have been possible, and whose fault it was that there had been no agreement. With his arguments, Hollweg tried to defend the German Navy and to put all the blame on Great Britain. On the other hand, these views were an expression of his bitterness about Germany losing her great power status due to a war which, in his perception, Great Britain had fought against Germany to secure British naval supremacy. And now Great Britain was about to lose this supremacy in Washington. Furthermore, his arguments were an expression of his disappointment that, I quote, at a time when sea power became more meaningful than ever before for the possession of world power qualifications, we are not present in Washington where the notion of sea power is reshaped, quote, unquote. So the question of sea power was another topic that featured prominently in Hollweg's articles. First of all, he argued that the Germans and the German politics, diplomacy, and the army leadership had never understood the true meaning of sea power. Through the use of sea power as a deterrent, Hollweg argued, Great Britain had been able to compel the neutral powers one after the other into a giant coalition against Germany, while Germany, due to the insufficient understanding of the meaning of sea power, had been too reluctant to make use of the fleet in the war to, I quote, break the English will to annihilation, unquote. He blamed German politics, diplomacy, and the army leadership for the inactivity of the fleet. And he equally blamed Great Britain for her use of sea power, that is, to get rid of economic rivals, to deny sea power to other powers, and the British way of waging the war, especially the blockade. He saw the Washington Conference as, I quote, an outcry against this method of the use of sea power. In the diminishment of the English fleet strength, America sees a means to protect herself and the world from such rapes in the future, unquote. So the second topic I want to talk about with regards to agency is actually a non-topic. What I mean with this is that I expected this topic to feature prominently in the German newspapers, but it did not. It is the link between the preamble of Part 5 of the Treaty of Versailles and the Washington Conference. In the Treaty of Versailles, it was claimed that the German arms limitation or disarmament was the key to a future disarmament of all the other signatory powers. From other sources, it is quite clear that at least parts of the German government, the Foreign Ministry, and the Reichswehrministerium in 1921 were of the opinion that after Germany had fulfilled her obligations of the Versailles Treaty, the other powers should now fulfill their obligations at the Washington Conference. However, there were internally doubts that the other powers would reduce their armaments. While the German government did not communicate these opinions openly, becomes evident in an internal statement of the Foreign Ministry. I quote, "With regards to the question of general disarmament, the best policy for Germany should be great reluctance. At the moment, it will be hardly possible for a German statesman to convince the world that Germany has finally accepted her disarmament. Every emphasis of an obligation to disarmament of the other powers from our side will only result in strengthening the opposition of militarists in the other countries, namely France." Unquote. It seems that the three newspapers shared this policy of restraint and their view about the negative effects of voicing the demand that the victorious powers should fulfill their obligations. There is no single article that expresses this demand directly. There are only a few articles in which there is at least a hint to this connection. One example is a guest commentary from Dr. Friedrich Rosen on November 8, 1921 in the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung. Rosen had been German foreign minister from May 23rd until October 22nd, 1921. In his article, "Was wird Washington bringen?" he gave a detailed account of the Pacific situation and the interests of the powers in the Pacific. He wrote about naval armaments as well as the influence of these issues on the general question of disarmament. He made it very clear that he had expected that the other powers would already have started to fulfill their treaty obligations. I quote, "One could have believed, and most believed it, that if Germany is totally disarmed according to the dictate of Versailles, the dawn of peaceful times begins, and that the war armaments of the victorious powers towards Central Europe will be limited by itself. But we are far from that." Unquote. Although he did not directly voice any demands for disarmament, it is plausible to assume that his readers had this association. He was clearly disappointed that there had been no automatic disarmament of the other powers. In his opinion, the German disarmament had not brought peace, but weakness and defenselessness, and he believed that the, I quote, "disarmament of Germany that had been depicted as the only disturbing element for the peace of the world was actually a step towards new conflicts and confrontations," unquote. His view on the effects of the Versailles Treaty was shared by all political parties, but I'm not going to talk further about this. So I wrap it up now. The analysis of the three German newspapers showed the strong interest of the German press and the German public in the Washington Conference. It further gave an impression of the sentiments, opinions, and agency of the three newspapers and individual naval officers. To reach a conclusion about German public opinion about the conference and disarmament is a difficult task, however. The opinions voiced in the three newspapers with regards to the conference and the question of disarmament were heterogeneous, which most certainly expresses the heterogeneity of the German public opinion. However, there is one area for which it is plausible to come to a conclusion about the German public opinion and sentiments through the newspaper coverage. That is, the French attitude towards disarmament, the criticism about the so-called German peril, and Briand's speech. All three newspapers equally defended Germany against the French claims and shared the views about a militaristic and imperialistic France. This does not mean that I ignore nuances and differences in the details. However, the similarity is evident and makes it plausible to equate the opinion of the press and public opinion. So, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation and for the precise conclusions at the end. I think we will have to discuss them later on. As announced, we will direct you directly proceed in the program, and I'd like to present to you Commander Dr. Christian Jentsch from the also from Potsdam, from the Center for Military History and Social Sciences. He joined the Navy in 1995. After his officer training, he began a career as an aviation officer in 2001 and had been a helo operation officer at the Naval Air Wing 5 in Kiel from 2002 to 2008. Afterwards, he had been a scientific assistant at the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg, which is the University of the Armed Forces. And later on, from 2011 to 15, he had been a lecturer on military history in the German Naval Academy in Flensburg-Mürwik. And since 2015, the year where he also got his PhD at the University of Potsdam, he is research assistant at the Center for Military History and Social Sciences in Potsdam. And since 2007, he's also a lecturer at the University of Potsdam. He published several works on naval history, for example, from cadet to admiral, about the education of German and British naval officers in the imperial era before the First World War. He published on the First World War together with Jan Witt, and also some articles. He has a broad interest in naval history, and today he's working on contemporary military history, on Navy missions abroad, but he also, as mentioned, worked on the Imperial German Navy in the First World War. Today he will talk to us about the effect of the Washington Naval Treaty and its successors on the Reichs- and Kriegsmarine. Christian, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm starting my presentation right now. So, okay, on December 22nd, 1946, the German heavy cruiser Prince Eugen capsized at the Kwajalein Atoll in the Central Pacific after surviving 2 atomic trials. This marked the end of the era of German capitalism. This ship was a so-called treaty cruiser, according to the regulations of the 1920s to 1930s naval treaties. Interestingly, Germany never signed. But why build the Reichs- and Kriegsmarine ships in compliance with these agreements? To answer these questions, our first the Reichsmarine in the early 1920s, and then follow the development towards the Kriegsmarine building policy before the Second World War. The aim is to explain why a non-signatory power accepted the naval treaties for its own navy and operational limitations disposed to the war effort of the Kriegsmarine. The German Navy ships escaped a flow on June 21st, 1990. 53 ships, the bulk of the old high seas fleet, sank to the bottom of Scapa Sound. Just a week later, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Navy was restricted to 50,000 seamen, including 1,500 officers. No conscription was allowed. The fleet had to consist at a maximum of 6 pre-dreadnoughts, 6 small cruisers, 12 destroyers, 12 torpedo boats, and 38 minesweepers. The former second largest sea power of the world became a minor local navy with a focus in the Baltic, but the key personnel remained the same and dreamed of better times too. New ships were only up to 10,000 tons, light cruisers up to 6,000 tons, and destroyers to 800 tons. This posed a severe problem for the future. What kind of capital ship can be built with only 10,000 tons? The last dreadnought type class, the Bayern of the Great War, displaced already more than 30,000 tons. Therefore, left-wing politicians even thought about an end of an independent German navy and discussed the integration into the army. The main aim of leading admirals was to secure the future of the organization navy. As a rear backdrop was the role of the naval infantry and the admiralty during the Kap Lüttwitz Putsch in March 1920. As a reaction, Vice Admiral Paul Behnke succeeded as chief of the navy and steered the navy through. I will come to the Reichsmarine era. The strategic military thinking in Germany was focused on continental war. A grand strategy did not exist, and so Vice Admiral Michaelis developed the naval strategy and first plans for the Reichsmarine. Basic assumption of war of Poland. Admiral Behnke anticipated a French support as well as British neutrality. France had possible opponents, not only the Baltic, but the North Sea had to be secured by the Reichsmarine. Protection of the sea lines of communication and the coastal defense had to be secured, and was the mission. According to the French naval strength, priority was given to the Baltic. War against the Royal Navy was out of imagination due to its enormous numerical superiority. Even if the operational concept made sense, it was absolutely unlikely to communicate it outside of naval offices because it was not kind of German foreign and domestic policies. Only in the late 1920s, France became officially a possible enemy. Until then, only the Baltic was the center of gravity of operational and tactical planning. In between, an international development began, which would play a major role in the conceptual process for the construction of new capital ships. The scuttling of a high seas fleet changed the naval relations of the former Allied sea powers. Shipbuilding programs in Great Britain, Japan, and the US in the 1919s and 1921 looked at this arms race. A way to stop this potential disastrous development was a conference of 5 leading naval powers. US led to the Washington Conference from 1921 to February 1922. The 5 states accepted maximum sizes of their capital ship tonnage in relation to recent fleet strength and the general limitation of ship sizes. German naval officers had mixed feelings about the conference, even as it was the first real arms limitation conference for Germany. It meant that the French Navy was a potential enemy in a future war with Poland, but it was still out of reach as long as the Versailles Treaty was in force. France had an allowance of 175,000 tons on battleships and was far in favor of the future, not to think of naval aviation or even submarines. After the signing of the Washington Treaty, it had nearly no effect on the Reich, with one exception. The calculation of ships tonnage. According to Washington regulations, ships could be constructed about 12 to 15% larger than defined in the Versailles Treaty, and it was used for warships without informing the Allied powers. They never protested against it. In the early 1920s, struggled for domestic consolidation. The first new ships to be built were light cruisers. Was first approved in 1921. In 1924, Admiral Hans Zenker became the Navy. 3 modern K-class cruisers were approved in the following year. Then the Navy started the planning process for the replacement of the old pre-dreadnoughts. First thoughts indicated the massive problem in constructing a 4,000-ton ship as a replacement for a capital ship. In a assumption of perception, the Navy concluded that the best way to get rid of the Versailles limitations would be the partial future use of Washington definitions. The first plans clearly showed that a 10,000-ton ship was not a match for any future battleship. On the other side, the tonnage combined with a large caliber main gun would create a ship design well above the fighting power of a treaty cruiser. In early summer 1925, 5 design sketches ranged from large cruiser design to heavily armed vessels. The Navy decided in summer 1927 in favor of a design with 11-inch guns. In combination with a new powerful diesel engine allowing for 28 knots and an armor belt, they created a ship faster than any French battleship and better armed, the future pocket battleship. For domestic reasons, for approval only in 1928. It caused severe debates in the parliament and played a major role in the 1928 elections. More important in our context was the foreign dimension. Even as the ship was in accordance with the Versailles Treaty, it disturbed the Washington Treaty and forced at least the French to react. This deliberate offense on the naval arms limitations was an opportunity to become integrated into the naval treaties. Disappointingly, the anticipated reaction of the major sea powers. Why was this seen as a chance? The incorporation in the league of sea powers meant that at least for the Reichsmarine, strict of Versailles could be replaced by the Washington Treaty, allowing a far greater for the Reichsmarine, the acceptance by the naval powers became the new aim. And that's why a treaty for the limitation of a fleet size was more than interesting to Germany. It offered the Reichsmarine a sole because no equivalent treaty existed for the army. While the UK and the US saw it as an option for Germany to further naval arms conferences, France strictly refused anything that would revision the Treaty of Versailles. In the Reichsmarine tried to circumvent the arms limitation on submarines and aircraft by using secret money and civil companies owned by the Navy. A German financial network as the so-called Lohmann affair. As a result, replaced Admiral Beinken in December 1924 by Vice Admiral Riga, the Navy, and wanted her to provide a long-term shipbuilding program, the so-called Schiffbauersatzplan. It was intended to exploit the limits given by the Versailles Treaty. Accepted the proposal on June 18, 1929, and the Navy presented the plan on October 8. The attempt was to control the shipbuilding and to avoid illegal and secret activities by the Reichsmarine. What looked at the first glance very favorable proved to be a tie to radar. Even so, the Navy could expect to build more ships in the future, it still had to stick to the 10,000 tons. And this was not in the interest of the Navy. She wanted to build 35,000 ton ships according to the Washington Treaty. The problem was that the program, totally exploiting limitations, would cement Versailles for the next years. They had a need of 8 pocket battleships until 1940 as for aging pre-dreadnoughts. In 1930, the cabinet split the project into 2 equal parts. Until 1937, and then the second batch would be accepted. Raeder realized 2 batches. He hoped that the limitations of Versailles could be replaced by the Naval Treaty in 1937. In this case, they could immediately change their program to battleships. Reichswehrminister Gröner and Admiral had the maximum according to the will and established a long-term building program. Still, the Marineleitung aspires towards the full integration into the Naval Treaty. The maximum in the official domestic perspective was needed in operational terms. The operational aim was parity with the French Navy, 5% of the UK or US tonnage allowance according to the treaty. In other words, the Reichsmarine desperately needed integration into the League of Sea Powers. But this was not in accordance with German domestic as foreign politics. And that's why Raeder's real intentions had to be kept secret. This changed in 1931 when the Reichswehr broke the limitations resting upon Germany. The army planned to increase its size from 100,000 to 300,000 soldiers and called this Umbau plan or reconstruction plan. Raeder realized the opportunity and exploited the situation and the claims. At the Geneva Conference, Germany aspired the same status as the in late 1932. It threatened to leave the conference if this wasn't guaranteed. Vice Minister Schleicher said that Germany already had reached all the Versailles reduction goals, but the Allied powers broke their promise to reduce their armies. He understood this as a breach of the contract, which meant that Germany was not bound to it any further. In consequence, on December 11, 1932, the Five-Power Declaration was released and Germany became an equal partner. That was the starting point for the rearmament of the army, and the Navy got its share as well. Raeder's Umbau plan did not exceed the Versailles tonnage limitations, but included modern weapon systems. 6 Panzerschiffe, 1 aircraft carrier, 6 cruisers, 6 destroyer half flotillas, 3 minesweeping and torpedo boat flotillas, 16 submarines, and an increase of manpower up to 24,300 men until 1930. And what is most important for this topic, it remained inside the Washington and London Naval Conference limitations. With this restraint, the Marineleitung still hoped to become incorporated into future naval conferences. On the other hand, more could not be achieved than the self-perception of a continental power. But even the Umbau plan offered a vector opportunity because the Navy did not specify the tonnage of the proposed 6 Panzerschiffe. As already with the Schiffbau Ersatz program, if Germany was accepted as part of the naval treaties, it could start to build battleships at once. But many Navy officers did not possess Raeder's foresight and claimed he did not exploit the situation for the Navy. They did not really understand the interaction of foreign politics and domestic objectives. Until the end of the Weimar Republic, the Marineleitung tried to gain as many ships as possible. France was the enemy of the future, and the size of its navy was a reference for the proposed German free trade. As long as Germany stuck to the Treaty of Versailles, the chiefs of the Navy officially remained limitations, but aspired for the Washington Treaty. The attempt to disturb the treaty by constructing the Panzerschiffe to become part of it failed. This showed the influence and importance of the Washington Treaty on the signatory power. As long as the German Navy sought to become part of it, the Marineleitung remained inside the state of the treaty. It can be concluded that international arms limitation allured countries to join them if they could improve their international position by accepting the given rules. In the case of the democratic Germany, this mechanism worked. Whatever was domestically achievable was constructed and not what strategic or operational planning would necessitate. This has been a foundation for a future Navy. the and the Kriegsmarine. In January 1936, Hitler rapidly turned Germany into a dictatorship, but still the Navy play an important role in the future foreign naval policy. On October 14, 1933, Germany left the League of Nations at the Geneva Conference. Its multilateral orientation changed towards bilateral pacts as long as they were opportune. Very early, Hitler explained to the chiefs of the Navy and the Army his distant aim to conquer and fight the Bolshevism. As a historical lesson, Hitler realized the importance of good relations with Great Britain or even an alliance to frontal war. Hitler guaranteed at least for the Royal Navy would not become a threat to the Reichsmarine, and it looked like Raeder believed it. This put the Navy and Raeder into a dilemma. On the one hand, it was supposed to build a Navy to fight France, and on the other hand, the same Navy had to be acceptable for Great Britain. For a war with France, we assumed ships with 35,000 tons each. Germany would need 280,000 tons for this class, but allowing for France to attract Royal Navy, only about 180,000 tons were available. The Foreign Office expected that the 35%, according to Washington, were acceptable to the UK. Because France did not sign the 1930 London Treaty, limiting the lighter naval forces, this posed another problem, especially in cruisers and destroyers. It was well above the 35% of the Royal Navy. Hitler decided that a fleet agreement with Great Britain was more important than the numerical relation to France. Here we can see a problem based on the fact that not all countries from Washington signed the following London treaties. Germany would be invited to the 1935 London Conference. Therefore, all the new plans and ships had to be recorded to the preceding conferences between both countries and, of course, the changing market. Nevertheless, Hitler put a lot of diplomatic into the agreement with Great Britain and followed consequently his step-down policy. The contract was signed on the 18th of June 1935, the 120th anniversary of Waterloo. 35% was defined, with the exception of 35% for the submarines, later increased to 100%. This quality standard of the Washington and London conferences limiting ship sizes and armament were included. So the 1.2 million tons of the Royal Navy allowed the Kriegsmarine to build about 148,000 tons in capital ships, about 50,000 tons in aircraft carriers, 50,000 tons heavy cruisers, and so on. For Great Britain, the treaty offered the opportunity ties to Nazi Germany in a bilateral agreement, and Hitler expected it to act as a cornerstone for a future alliance. Concerning the foreign policy, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement was seen as an official replacement for the line by guarantee power. I conclude that the contract with signatory power demanding the acceptance of the existing naval treaties forced the non-signatory power into a factual situation, accepting the naval treaties without agreement. Another interesting effect is that the Anglo-German Naval Agreement kept Germany out of the 1935 London Conference due to the heavy French interference. Following the events of the Munich Conference and the British guarantee for Poland in March 1939, Hitler denounced the agreement in April 1939. The Kriegsmarine perception of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement was positive. 35% allowed less warships than France per warship classes. Some were calling for 50%. Most older Navy officers were disappointed because they hoped that Germany would become again. For Raeder, it was his first step to build a navy for a global power and not a European continental power. But what was most important, the Kriegsmarine had to build a well-balanced fleet mirroring the Royal Navy in smaller dimensions. It's worth to remember that the Imperial German Navy estimated at least 2/3 ratio for a major naval engagement to have a chance of success. From the British point of view, the Kriegsmarine was under control and the Empire was allowed to focus again on the Pacific theater. During the following years, German shipbuilding was in accordance with the agreement, even though the tonnage of ships was usually higher than officially stated. And this all maybe at the time. A large problem proved to be the lack of strategic resources, shipbuilding capacities, and even skilled workers. Dockyards were not able to build as fast as the Kriegsmarine demanded it within the next 10 years. In the rearmament policy of behind the Army and the Air Force. Most historians claim the Z plan to be the climax of German maritime operational as well as strategical concepts. For an analysis of the fighting capacity of the Kriegsmarine in the Second World War, this plan does not play any role. None of the planned ships were finished. Historically important was the building program from 1935, in accordance with the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, and of course the naval treaties. The Kriegsmarine planned until 1942 a fleet of 8 capital ships, 3 aircraft carriers, 5 heavy cruisers, 11 light cruisers, 40 destroyers, and 45 submarines. Reflecting the economic problems of maritime armament, 7 capital ships and about 2/3 of the other classes was a realistic assumption until 1942 in the eyes of radar. And he was right, because this was, with the exception of submarines, the German fleet during the first stages of the war until 1941. A balanced fleet mirroring the Royal Navy and in no aspect really threatening her superiority. For understanding, it's worth to mention that the Z plan came into mind after the Sudetenland Agreement, and it was accepted in 1939, but it did not play any role in the coming war because it wouldn't materialize. And it's important for 2 reasons. First, it proves that Hitler had planned a war against Great Britain and the Royal Navy. It can even be seen as a direct approach to take over the role of the US as the last remaining superpower. And second, the discussion in the committee revealed different ideas about future naval war. But in terms of naval treaties, this marked the end of Germany's acceptance of multilateral arms agreements. The impact on ship designs and operational capabilities. 1934, the new battleships in construction were the Ersatz D and E, later Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, with ever-changing design. Originally, they were heavily influenced by the Dunkirk design. Construction was stopped and continued again in 1935. The Kriegsmarine tried to arm them with 15-inch guns. Political reasons only allowed 11-inch guns, like the Panzerschiffe. To save time, it was planned to modify them to 15 inches, but it never materialized. They were stronger than the French Dunkirk, but much too weak in comparison to any other 35,000-ton battleship. Only the most popular German warships, Bismarck class, became a match in international battleship design. As the Kriegsmarine got the tonnage allowance for the heavy cruisers, they started construction of any tactical or operational concept, because every sea power did so. The result was a ship with no real need in the flotilla compositor of the Kriegsmarine. Officially a 10,000-ton cruiser, the Naval class displaced at least 14,000 tons. What was even worse is that no real tactical or operational tasks were defined. Whilst the US Navy needed powerful cruisers with a large range for the Pacific and the Royal Navy a large number of cruisers for their segment of communication of the maybe crumbling empire, the Kriegsmarine had only a rough idea what they were good for. In the end, they were used as commerce radars and a substitute for desperately missing battleships. In both, they did not perform well because of deficiencies with their high-pressure hot steam propulsion system. The expected range was far less than planned, and the high-pressure were unreliable. These ships were constructed too fast with no experience in heavy cruiser construction. The main reason was to build the allowed tonnage for heavy cruisers as fast as possible due to the treaties. All light cruisers were planned already by the Reichsmarine and passed the Reichstag in this time. They were already outdated in 1969 in comparison to modern ship design. The history of the Panzerschiffe was already made. Last, the destroyer design of the Kriegsmarine faced the same problems with the high-pressure propulsion system because time was pressing, untested, and unreliable steam engines had to be used. What really worsened was the limited operational range and unsound stability in heavy weather. None of the capital ships of the Z plan was finished at all. After 1941, only submarine warfare against Great Britain, respectively Allied sea lines of communication, was continued. Like in the First World War, it was the sole option for the weaker German naval force. The well-balanced fleet of 1939, in accordance with the Versailles, Washington and Anglo-German naval agreements, had no chance at all to fight successful a naval war against Great Britain and France. The Kriegsmarine of 1939 resembled a navy for war against France, and not the Royal Navy. Fleet building was and still is a matter of decades and years, an endurance pace and not a sprint. The long shadow, my conclusion, the long shadow of the international arms limitation treaties of the 1920s and 30s reached even beyond Washington's system towards the non-signatory Germany. I think I identified two main reasons: attractiveness to smaller states or otherwise limited third-rate navies to become a member of the club of sea power states to raise national reputation. The Reichsmarine, according to the Versailles Treaty, was deemed to be such a minor navy with no option for an increase in quantity and quality as long as it adhered to that treaty. Second, the high attraction of the naval arms limitations to the German Navy because it offered an option or even a diplomatic lever to exchange the strict and rigid Versailles Treaty with the far more generous Washington Treaty and its successors. What was attractive to Germany attracted Great Britain too. As long as Germany was acting in accordance with the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, its naval rearmament was predictable and posed no vital threat to the Royal Navy. It was a situation for the armament against the old Imperial German Navy 25 years before. According to the operational capabilities of the Kriegsmarine in the war, this was very favorable to the Royal Navy. The existing German fleet was never such a potent and dangerous force as the High Sea Fleet. Even after the denouncement of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, the effect lasted for years, the time span for the construction of a fleet. If there's one thing to learn from the German relation to the Washington Treaty and its effects, it is always worth thinking about arms limitation treaties as a diplomatic tool. For different reasons, even non-signatory states may act in accordance with them if their national interest, foreign politics, or domestic reasons dictate it. And this is usually in the favor of the self-restricting signatory powers. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, Christian, thank you very much for your paper and for painting this picture of this long-lasting shadow of the Washington Treaty, even in Germany. And last but not least, we come to the paper of Dr. Guntram Schulze-Wegner. I'd like to welcome him here on this panel. He is editor of the magazine of two German magazines, Military and History, Militär und Geschichte, and Schiff Classic, a title which doesn't need to be translated. He's commander of the reserve of the German Navy. He was educated, studied in Marburg, in Hesse, in Kiel, and in St. Petersburg. He studied modern and contemporary history, Russian and Eastern European history, and he did his PhD on German naval armament between 1942 and 1945. He published several publications. The last one is about tradition, values, and self-perception of the German Navy. He published a biography on the Emperor Wilhelm I, on the Minister of War Albrecht von Roon, and also history of the German Navy called Germany at Sea. Today, we remain with this paper in the 1930s at the end of the Washington system. He will talk about the construction of battleships by the naval powers in the 1930s. So it's up to you. Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan, for your kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be able to participate in this conference. I hope the conference is interesting and exciting for you many greetings from one of the world's most beautiful cities. Many greetings from Hamburg to Annapolis. Here in Hamburg, it is already dark outside, but otherwise everything is very cozy here. The only thing missing is the after-work beer, but coming soon. Ladies and gentlemen, what am I going to do? In the following, I'll give you an overview of international battle fleet constructions in the 1930s, and I hope it will not be too steely. Now, let me start my presentation. I want to Thailand. Do you see the first picture?
Yes.
First picture. All major naval powers deployed modern battleships during World War II. Although they consumed vast amounts of resources, they rarely decided the few naval battles of this war, which consequently heralded the end of expensive ship types. The future belonged to aircraft carriers and submarines, which had already become apparent in First World War. The question is, why the United States, Great Britain, Japan, France, Italy, Germany, and the Soviet Union nevertheless relied on battleships in their planning in 1930s? Here is the answer. The size of battleships still represented the economic prowess and maritime power of industrialized nations, and it increased proportionately with the likelihood of a new war. A powerful navy reflected by battleships, which were built as part of a maritime strategy to be prepared for war, could not be improvised. These ships had to be planned, and construction took several years. After the Treaty of London expired in 1936, and after Germany and Japan left the League of Nations in the same year, all barriers fell. The weight that had temporarily shifted to heavy and light cruisers in international fleet armament shifted back to battleship construction. Let's take a closer look at the construction of battleships of individual navies, and you see Vittorio Veneto of Italy. In the early 1930s, the Italian Navy was the first to depart from the previous limitation of the existing naval agreements and design bigger battleships. Up to then, Italy had possessed only 4 obsolete World War I battleships. The result of this thinking was the new heavy Vittorio Veneto class, also known as the Littorio class. 2 ships, Vittorio Veneto and Littorio, were launched in 1937 before entering service in the spring of 1940. The construction of 2 further ships, Roma and Impero, had begun in 1938, though the latter was never completed. Roma and her sister ships had a service displacement of nearly 46,000 tons, with 237 meters long and just under 33 meters wide. Their propulsion power was 128,000 shaft horsepower, and top speed was 30 knots. The ship's greatest weakness was their short range. At 60 knots, they could only cover a distance of approximately 4,600 nautical miles. 9 guns of 38.1 centimeters divided into 3 triple turrets ensured high combat power for the most modern Italian battleship. The Roma was completed in 1942 as the last ship of her class, but due to Italy's overall strategic situation, she was hardly used in 1942-43. Now you see France battleship Jean Bart. The Richelieu was the French Navy's most combat-capable ship, designed in response to ambitious Italian construction plans in the early 1930s. The keel of the first ship of the class named after her was laid in 1935, and she was launched in 1939. Her sister ship, Jean Bart, was launched a year later, and the other two sister ships, Clemenceau in Gascogne, could not be completed or started due to the war. The Richelieu class had a service displacement of just over 48,000 tons. With a speed of 30 knots and a propulsive power of 150,000 shaft horsepower, she was one of the fastest and most powerful battleships. At 18 knots, she could cover a distance of 5,500 nautical miles. The Richelieu's biggest drawback was her armament. She had two quad turrets with 38 centimeter guns. However, these turrets turned out to have a faulty design. The inadequate air defenses also proved to be deficient and had to be redesigned several times. 3 days after its completion, on June 15th, 1940, the Richelieu left Brest to avoid falling into the hands of advancing German troops. Now you see Germany. The German Reich began building the 26,000 tons battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in 1934. Their main armament limited to 928 guns for political reasons. The German-British Naval Agreement of 1935, Christian mentioned. Under the tonnage granted of that agreement, Germany launched the first 35,000 tons battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz a year later, with heavy artillery of 8 38 centimeter guns in 4 twin turrets elevated fore and aft. The powerful center artillery, 12 by 15 centimeters, and flak, 16 by 10.5 centimeters, make the two German battleships fighting machines whose special steel alloys provide excellent armor protection. In addition, the subdivisions gave the ship a high degree of stability. The German propaganda liked to speak of unsinkable in this context. With a standard displacement of 41,000 tons, operation displacement maximal 53,000 tons, and a design speed of 29 knots at over 150 shaft horsepower, Bismarck and Tirpitz were on par with the Italian Vittorio and the French Richelieu. Now we come to Great Britain, and you see King George V. In response to the Italian-French-German arms race, the hitherto reticent British Navy called for a powerful new battleship class in 1937, and it was designed that same year. The first ship to be launched was the King George V in 1939. She also gave her name to a new class and was completed in 1940. She was joined by 4 other ships: Prince of Wales, Duke of York, Howe, and Anson. All ships had a service displacement of just under 43,000 tons, a length of 227 meters, a breadth of 39 meters, and an average draft of 9.9 meters. Propulsion power was 110,000 shaft horsepower, and speed was 28.5 knots. Thus, in all respects, the King George V proved to be a bit smaller and less powerful than the German Bismarck class. At a speed of 10 knots, however, she could cover a cruising distance of 15,600 nautical miles. 10 35.6 centimeter guns were housed in 2 quad turrets and a twin turret. During the war, the anti-aircraft defenses were continuously reinforced and the ship was equipped with radar. After entering service, the King George V served as a flagship of the British Home Fleet and initially secured Allied convoys in the Atlantic. Now you see United States. It's North Carolina, most beautiful battleship, isn't it? The US registers earlier of the will of other powers to disregard the construction restriction of the existing naval agreements. At this time, the US Navy also began its planning, but kept it strictly secret. The US public was to be made aware that other powers were undermining the provisions of the agreements first. In 1937, the Navy laid the keel of its most modern battleship, the USS North Carolina in New York. The ship gave its name to the new class, which also included the identically constructed Washington. The operational displacement of the two ships was 45,087 tons each, their length 222 meters, their breadth 33 meters. Their propulsive power of 121 shaft horsepower enabled top speed of 28 knots. With a cruising range of 15,000 nautical miles at an average of 15 knots, the North Carolina class ships has also had a long range. With her 9 40.6 centimeter guns distributed among 3 triple turrets, the North Carolina could take on any opponent. Nominally completed in April 1941, the ship was not ready for war for quite some time. It was until late 1941 that it was able to enter the Pacific. From then on, the North Carolina took part in the most important battles of the theater of war there, including at Guadalcanal. In 1945, she finally shelled the Japanese capital of Tokyo. She was one of the few battleships not to be sunk or scrapped. This is Japan. This is Yamato, a little bit stretched by photographer. In December 1934, the Empire of Japan terminated the existing naval agreements and began developing a large and powerful battleship fleet. Its crowning achievement was to be a new class of battleships that would eclipse all battleship design in size and armament. The Yamato, launched in 1937, gave its name to the new class of ships. She was joined by the Musashi and the Shinano, the latter of which was completed as an aircraft carrier. 2 other planned ships of the class did not come to fruition. The Yamato class had an operational displacement of 71,100 tons, a weight never again achieved by battleships. Its length of 263 meters and breadth of 36.9 meters were also unique. For comparison, Bismarck has 250 meters long and 36 meters wide. Her 12 boilers achieved a propulsive power of 150,000 shaft horsepower, which still brought the Yamato and the Musashi to a speed of little more than 27 knots. The Yamato class also set new standards in terms of armor, with armor plates of up 560 millimeter thick, confined mainly to the main citadel. Also unrivaled was the armament. 9 46 centimeter guns in 3 triple turrets provided tremendous firepower. The exact specifications of the ships, built in complete secrecy, remained unknown to the Allies until the end of the war. In the end, the inadequate air defense for a ship of this size proved to be a weakness. Thus, the Yamato and the Musashi demonstrated most impressively that the age of battleships was definitely over. During the war, they were unable to achieve any decisive military success and were both finally sunk by American aircraft in 1945. Now we came to the Soviet Union, and this is Marat ex-Petropavlovsk. The USSR represented a special case among the naval powers of World War II. When German troops invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the Red Fleet did not possess a single battleship that could compete with the ships of the other great powers. Although the construction of 4 large Sovietsky Soyuz-class battleships had begun from 1938, their construction was abandoned after the German attack, and much of the material was used elsewhere. With a mission displacement of 70,256 tons and 9 40.6 centimeter guns, these ships would have been serious contenders. The Navy also abandoned completion of the 4 planned Kronstadt-class battleships in 1941. Construction had begun in 1939. When German troops found one of the ships in Mykolaiv after the conquest of Ukraine, it was only 10% complete. Consequently, the Soviet Union still had to rely on its 3 Gangut-class battleships on its war against the German Reich. These had already been laid down in 1909 and completed shortly after the start of the First World War. With an operational displacement of 26,263 tons, a length of 182 meters, and a breadth of 26.6 meters, they were relatively small. Nor could their propulsive power of 42,000 shaft horsepower, their range of 5,000 nautical miles, and their armament of 12 30.5 centimeter guns compete with battleships of other nations. The British government provided assistance, lending the Soviet Union its battleship Royal Sovereign in 1943, which the Red Fleet named Archangels. Now I will give you a conclusion. Except for the Soviet Union, all naval powers possessed state-of-the-art battleships at the beginning of World War II, but the actual deployment at no time justified the enormous expenditure of men and resources to build and maintain them. The war in Europe was decided on land and from the air, and in the Pacific by aircraft carriers and atomic bombs. Only the numerically underrepresented submarines redeemed what had been foreshadowed in the First World War. If the material had gone into the massive buildup of submarine weaponry instead of the construction of battleships, the war would probably have taken a different turn. Thank you for your interest and your attention, and I'm all ready to answer some questions if I can do it with my English. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Before we come to the question and answers, we come to the commentary by Keith Bird. I think it isn't necessary to introduce him. He's very well known member of the US Naval Institute, has a lot of publications, a sheer endless list on German naval history. For example, a guide to German naval history literature or the biography on Elfriede. I'm looking forward to your commentary. Thank you very much. And yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here, and particularly I'm very honored by the Center for Military History and Social Sciences for asking me to comment. I had other plans for this conference, but it was such an honor because I have to tell you that none of my books or articles would ever have been written without the support, particularly in the 70s and 80s, without what that time was called, Military Research Office in Freiburg, and then in Potsdam that I visited in 2004 and met the next generation of German historians, and you see them here absolutely outstanding representation of scholarship. So I've certainly got a lot of very positive things. Let me start with Karin's paper. Again, a solid piece of scholarship, well organized. I would have to tell you that as excellent as her paper was, her presentation here and the additional materials that she added for this audience were superb. And I want you to know that. I want to have a copy of that, by the way. It certainly adds to our understanding of the German attitude towards the series of international disarmament and arms limitation negotiations that began at Washington, which another thing this panel did is we actually adhered to the conference theme, which was Washington. So that's a first for many conferences. But hopefully she will explore this further, this topic further, because I have been in the naval, clippings files in the naval records, and they certainly are very useful in determining about not only the Navy, but also what was going on within the public sphere and so forth. But this topic is particularly important because, as you've heard from all people, in terms of this period of economic and political crisis and consolidation, and she offers a valuable insight into a globalized press and the role of public opinion in shaping government policy. Given Germany's financial and economic situation and the burden of the Versailles Treaty, it is surprising that the German public was as interested in the Washington Treaty negotiations as we've seen here. Certainly the signatories and their publics were aware of their own issues and interest, but as far as inviting Germany, they dismissed Germany's military and naval power as negligible, and they believed Germany was subject to the authority of the Inter-Allied Military Commission. And besides, the German Navy was, I think we figured out the other day, a little over 12% of the size of the Imperial German Navy. I think it was something like 116,000 tons. So we are really talking about a negligible factor, definitely the dreaded coastal Navy that they feared. Although the Washington Conference ultimately did not address the German concerns, including global stability or questions of the economic problems that the war and the treaty caused, the much larger issue of the disarmament of the military and the ground forces that she suggests were not what was really ended up being covered at the conference. Three major German newspapers and many others that she knows of, and their political interests kept the German public well informed on these negotiations, specifically the naval disarmament, which became, as we know, a central theme. The coverage of the Navy is interesting to me because the Navy in the 1920s, as I said, was politically and militarily disgraced, since the Navy in 1920 had been the bearer of revolution, at first from the left and then from the right, according to observers. The scuttling of the fleet at Scapa Flow, as Christian mentioned, might have saved the Navy's honor, but additionally at the cost of 5 modern cruisers and reparations in terms of harbor facilities and so forth, which that industry did not exactly appreciate, to say the least. Colin, as she argues, the issue of how the Washington Conference might have affected Germany's obligations to pay reparations in general were in fact key considerations for both the Germans and the signatories. I also believe that the coverage of the importance of sea power, which she went into in much more detail for you, which I think very important, was a result of the decades of, the years of naval propaganda from the Navy League and from Tirpitz's Office of News and Disinformation. No, disinformation was not used at that time. But the Washington Conference gave the Navy a very valuable platform, and you've heard more words here today that I think are very, very important from Admiral Holweg, one of the commentators of the many that the Navy enlisted. I think that was in the years of the Nixon administration, where one of my files I found in the Naval Archives was entitled "Enemies of the Navy," and how to umfunktionieren, which I think you can get even in the German, the activities of speakers, writers, or other naval authorities who disagreed with the orthodoxies of the Marine Life Club. From my research, these records are quite revealing, and the Navy did, as I just suggested, did an active campaign, a concerted campaign, to defend the Navy and promote the necessity of German sea power and prestige. You would see this, obviously, until the administrations from Groner, the Reichswehr minister, starting in 1928, who basically, he and von Schleicher said to the Navy, stop it with the propaganda for the Panzerschiff. We will control the press during this period. Hitler, by the way, did the same thing. But when we look, we see that, as she mentioned, as Karen mentioned, the Navy had failed to fulfill its promises that it made before the war. She quite correctly said it was the Navy elites who had attempted to defend the Navy's poor wartime record that really merged with the questions of naval disarmament. So it was sort of a precursor of the type of campaign that would be mounted throughout the period, or attempted. The defense of the Navy and sea power as a measure of a nation's greatness became a key factor, as Commander Jens, as Christian said, shown in the Navy's efforts to utilize the Washington standards to break the chains of Versailles and build its oceanic navy. In this case, a real high seas fleet. Real high seas fleet. And finally, I agree that the government's efforts to show restraint was in fact the best strategy. As the Berliner Tageblatt states, I mean, who would have believed in the atmosphere of the 1920s, whereas one historian, Michael Geyer, suggested revisionism had become a national obsession? Would people have believed Germany had accepted its borders and disarmament? Certainly not the French. National security, and then it would prove this, as we heard from Christian also, throughout the 1930s, early 1930s. So clearly it's something that I think is a contribution, and I look forward to the next installment, Karen, as you develop this, and certainly like to see that. My second comments are dealing with Christian, and I know his works very well. I have most of them. They fill, along with Gutram's books, my library, and they're all excellent, excellent works. But it's also from a standpoint of, I think, and I should probably go to my conclusion at this point, because I think it's time, in case I need to hurry up so we can get to questions, which I think are the most important part, particularly since with all the virtual audience we've had, this is a large group of people for this session. So they take it very seriously. So I want to make sure that they get that. But I'm going to start off and make some comments, and then I'm not going to go through all of the other key points of Christian's presentation. But I want you to know that his analysis and his interpretations really represent probably the best summary of this period that exists in English. And I would certainly hope that you make this available to more English speakers in the coming future. It is really that good. But it definitely shows the effects of the International Disarmament Agreement, the use of the negotiations as a diplomatic tool, and the subsequent multilateral international naval disarmament negotiations that led us to a bilateral naval agreement. And by the way, to jump ahead to Gutram's presentation, in doing some of my research and looking at the Soviet Navy, it was very interesting to see that the Soviets, there was an Anglo-Soviet naval treaty that basically allowed the Japanese Navy to go beyond treaty limits in the Pacific, that was signed. So there's a larger context to all that you're presenting here, which I think is extremely important and deserves some more in-depth discussions. The influence of the Washington system and the subsequent treaties did have a fateful impact on the composition of the force structure. This paper addresses Germany's decision to adhere to these naval treaties despite its exclusion and those that followed until the 1932 League of Nations Disarmament Conference at Geneva in 1932 and 1934. While Kahn has presented the reasons for their decision not to include Germany, which of course the French opposed throughout. The only reason we had them in 1932, Germany was involved because it was a member of the League of Nations in the period of reconciliation in terms of German foreign policy, which was balanced, always that tension between revenge and reconciliation. And that lasted till about 1929 or so. Christian skillfully weaves the interplay of domestic and foreign factors and the internal debates within Germany. He's included not only the rearmament issue itself, strategy, but also the capabilities of Germany's shipbuilding industry. And that's what shaped, of course, the course of the policies in Weimar and the early years of Hitler's Third Reich. Christian also incorporates, as I said, the recent research with his interpretations that I think are extremely valuable. An excellent summary of how the Navy used the opportunities and constraints imposed by the Versailles Treaty and the Washington system. Given the Army's priority in national defense, the Navy's plans, though, remember, were at best a second thought with the government, and indeed to a large part of the population. Certainly their poor civil-military relations, the Lohman scandal, in terms of secret rearmament, brought the Navy to at one point, appropriately enough, he used this phrase about the Navy was like waving a red flag. I think he meant bullfighting, but the red flag was a little bit also perhaps symbolic. The Navy never expected that the Versailles Peace Treaty's restrictions on the size, ship classes, and replacement schedule would ever meet its requirements for an actual fleet or become the nucleus of a future fleet. I just wanted to restate that from evidence that I have read. Worse, I would note, some officers were concerned that any new construction, initially in those first years, might falsely signal the Navy's acceptance of Versailles. So there was that internal conflict, which would again emerge more when Rader would be accused of not taking advantage of what he could have done under the pre-Hitler governments from 29 to 32, or certainly by signing the Anglo-German Naval Treaty. I think one of the most significant conclusions that's demonstrated in this paper is the extent to which the Navy was developed in the 1920s as a political rather than a strategic instrument. It was designed to divide the Versailles signatories, a policy that can be characterized, as one historian has, as disastrous, and also a description of Rader shipyard programs which aimed unerringly, quote unquote, more for political prestige than military necessity. The description of the heavy cruiser that Christian talked about is a very good example for which the ship was built to take advantage of the fact that it was allowed under the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, but without regard to what do we do with it? How is it used? There was no doctrine or anything for it. And also the fact that the Navy adopted, deceptive arguments for new ships to justify the Navy's officially sanctioned mission. We're just interested in the Baltic and the North Sea, and oh yeah, there's the Atlantic. And we can always talk about, some historians mark that the first real operational plan that the German Navy had was actually in 1929, when the government, because of secret rearmament, actually got involved with determining the Navy's policy, as opposed to the previous independence or hands-off.
Sorry to interrupt
Pardon?
You have about 10 minutes.
About 10 minutes, and I'll wrap up here real quick. We could go on with your other examples, but I mean, we see the Z plan absolutely correct. We spend a lot of attention as historians, but the Z plan never became a Z fleet. I mean, that's the bottom line with that. And then, of course, we end up with a classic thing which ties Karin's presentation together with Christian's, is we have this scene where after the declaration is that we get a situation where Hitler stomps out of the Geneva conference, shocked, absolutely shocked that there was other powers had not disarmed. Now that's my movie line from Casablanca, so from there. Our third presenter, Bishop Wagner, outlines the effect of naval disarmament. I had a lot of real fun in developing this. This gives you an opportunity to develop some different ideas. And so I had a slant on this. It may not work, but we had a great discussion on this last night, Sebastian, in terms of the strategic signaling of the adherence to big battleship construction, new battleship construction. Certainly, the battleship, the core, reflected the prevailing belief in the 1930s that these ships represented the strategic instrument behind the economic and maritime power of the nation, which, of course, was Admiral Rader's mantra that the world power position of nations is identical with their ranking of sea powers. My one concept, and I could talk more about the relationship in terms of how Rader sold Hitler, who had been very suspicious of the Imperial German Navy's plans versus the type of ships that he wanted. They turned out to be the same. But basically, one of the things that I would like to suggest is that the supremacy of the battleship in all navies may have reflected what Nicholas Roger explored in his brilliant study of culture in the intellectual and psychological mindset that evolved from 1960 that played a real role in the emerging orthodoxies, emphasizing the cults of the offensive, the decisive battle, the ideological will to power. And these orthodoxies, I suggest, may speak to what he called the unspoken and unexamined assumptions about war, almost irrational thinking, well, we're doing this because, decisive battle. We'll talk about strategy, as Trippett said, after we win the decisive battle. It also may be that the battleship mystique, the sacred vessel, as Robert O'Connell's book on the cult of the U.S. battleship is entitled, is relevant. And we've recently had some interesting articles, Stefan knows, in a book you edited on Die Kriegsmarine, on new research trends, talking about things like the impact of the U-boat mythos on the culture and collective memory and the writing of naval history. And so, other than that, I will really break for the audience here for questions because I'm sure you have some questions. And I want to make sure you have the time to answer those questions. But thank you. It's been a real privilege to read your papers and to make comments. Thank you.
Yeah, Keith, thank you very much for your comments. We still have a few minutes for question. I saw there is a question in the audience at the back. Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Sebastian Bruns.
Hello, Sebastian.
I'm the inaugural McCain Fulbright Scholar here at the Naval Academy. Thank you for 3 excellent presentations. My question is to Guntram. In today's navies, where a certain class of ships represents national prestige, the aircraft carrier comes to mind. Maybe in this country, the LCS. I don't know about national prestige there. But in your work, did you come across heated debates about the value of the battleship, or was it more or less clear? Battleship is at the time the future. What was the kind of debate that was going on publicly? Maybe Karin, you can speak to that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian Bruns. Hallo, Sebastian. I think a battleship was a battleship, you know, and it's amazing that some modern-minded naval officers in the 1930s recognized the value of aircraft carriers, for example, and submarines as future successful weapons systems. In Germany, you know, for example, it was Commodore Karl Dönitz, later Commander-in-Chief in the Kriegsmarine, with regards to submarines, or Japanese Admiral Yamamoto. But for the old admirals, a battleship was a battleship. They could not prevail against the modern admirals could not prevail against the old admirals, the old thoughts and doctrines that had formed a rather closed system. This is my answer.
Thank you.
Okay, if I may, so I don't know about the 1930s, but I know about the time before. So battleships as a status symbol or a symbol for prestige, they have been status symbols since like 1895. Well, they developed to become the global status symbol for great power status and world power status around the turn of the century. And there were always debates, always in the public before 1914, and I think also in the 1920s, about the value of the battleships. And in the British Admiralty, for example, in 1919, they discussed about battleships, if the battleships are the future or if battle cruisers are the future for the British Navy. And the Admiralty comes to the conclusion quite clearly that battleships are a symbol, or that the prestige of the British Navy and that battleships are the means for prestige and the means for status, and that they are so significant for status and prestige that they cannot be abandoned. So that's the 1920s or the early 1920s. So that's what I can comment on. But there was always a discussion within the Navy and the public about the significance of the battleship. And if prestige is I would say, is an argument that is enough to build battleships. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's also the issue too in terms of naval theater. That great book on looking at launchings of submarines in Germany in before World War I. A launching of a battleship was something to show the power of the empire, of the monarchy, of the Kaiser. And in England, those launching ceremonies were to show and build up the image of the public towards the battleship as a sense of national identity. The two different conflicting type of messages or signal.
Yes, and when we come to naval force comparisons, which is actually my area of study, it's in 1989, for example, Lord Hamilton says that we can talk about our supremacy, but our supremacy is measured in battleships. And this idea about battleship as the prime measurement, or as the measurement for great power and naval status, to depict the status hierarchy and to measure the status hierarchy of the naval powers, is become so important that this is still in place in the 1920s. And you cited or you quoted Räder, and so that's that's quite obvious that it's still, this thinking is in place in the 1930s as well.
Yes, any further questions from the audience in Annapolis or from the virtual audience? No questions. So I have a question relating to the question of Sebastian. As I understand, you all mentioned the symbolic status of battleships and the importance as a kind of measurement for supremacy and naval power. But what about the battle itself? What did the Navy think about what the battleships were made for? So which kind of role played the battle in naval thinking? Maybe someone of you can talk a little bit about this.
So I don't know if anybody else wants, so just one sentence. So before 1914, it is clear that this decisive battle is very prominent in the thinking, in Germany particular, and in the United States. And in Great Britain, there is a debate, but in the 1903 Imperial Conference, there is a memorandum for the Imperial Conference, and still there, the British policy officially declares that the decisive battle is essential, and that's why battleships are essential. But this is just one sentence, and there is a huge debate about this, so that's not easy to answer.
Well, remember Tirpitz's comment too, pre-war, asking one of the admirals, what happens if they don't come?
Yeah.
According to the German perspective, I got the impression that it really changed before the First World War and during the First World War. It's the decisive battle, the day to decide who's the master of the seas, like Trafalgar, even Napoleonic thinking. What changed during the 1920s and 1930s is the perspective during the research of Arizona came up with a different approach, a diversification strategy. Warfare and a warfare with attrition to tear down the fighting Royal Navy, to prepare it for a small but battle in the end to take over the role of the Royal Navy. Another thing I would add to the question before is that we a discussion about the sense of aircraft. Already in 1990, the concept came up with an aircraft carrier. At the same time, it was already forbidden at every country was experimenting with aircraft carriers. But as far as I remember, the first trial successful when the Royal Navy tried to blow up the battleship Baden, it did not explode, did not sink. So they survived these trials. And I think this kind of trials put a lot of backfoot effort on the perspective on the future use of the aircraft carrier.
Yeah, Christian, thank you very much. I think due to the time, we have to come to an end. So if there's no urgent question, at least, I'd like to conclude this panel. A big hand for all the participants, and I wish you all, yes, a good conference, good follow-up panels, and yes, happy weekend and nice evening to all the panelists, and to you all, good afternoon. Yes, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Bye-bye.